that, I was working in secondary schools as a leading practitioner for psychology and research. And a very long time ago, I was a postgraduate researcher in psychology. And one of the things that has been an abiding interest of mine coming through as a teacher and now working for Teach First is how can we help new teachers, really put them in touch with the best available evidence that's out there. So what I'm going to present today is a report that's currently still in draft, looking at where are the opportunities within the very crowded curriculum of initial teacher education, where perhaps opportunities arise that will lay some of the foundations for new teachers coming into the profession so that they can engage with the research evidence that's already out there, but also over the course of their careers be able to make use of the evidence to come in terms of informing their practice and their pedagogy. So in terms of the report, Teach First is really proud. It's just launched a brand new programme working with schools and university partners over a 2-year programme to deliver a postgraduate diploma in education, whilst completing, obviously, the QTS and NQT years. And so the purpose of this really is to think out loud a bit about how do we support new teachers coming into the profession from early years all the way through to secondary, from quite a wide range of backgrounds and disciplines, life experiences, to be able to critically appraise the kind of research evidence they're going to encounter as teachers, but also how do we actually get that evidence not just sitting somewhere, whether on a journal article or on a website, but actually altering practice so that actually young people gain the advantage from it. So what did we do? Well, we had a chat, and it always amazes me how generous people who are interested in evidence-based education. I will say, just a huge thank you to everybody who contributed, either agreeing to be interviewed or suggesting resources and things. Some of these are extremely busy people, and it always amazes me how generous they are with their time. But also looking at some of the literature on the problem of knowledge mobilisation. How do we take research evidence coming out of universities and coming out of practice and actually translate that into something that teachers can use in the classroom? I think it's worth starting off though, just really having dispelling some myths and being very clear about what we mean by evidence-based practice and the role of evidence in education. I think there's a misconception about evidence-based education that somehow it works like a recipe, that from moment to moment in the classroom, it would dictate what the teacher does. Even if that was possible, I don't think it would be desirable. And actually, a much better use of research evidence is not to undermine professional judgment, but to inform it, to challenge it, and to refine that professional judgment, so that the kinds of decisions that teachers are making, not just moment to moment, but when planning sequences of learning or thinking about curriculum, they have these ideas in mind to help them solve the knotty problems that they'll face. There's also a great deal of debate about the kinds of terms that are used. You hear about research-led, evidence-based and evidence-informed practice. Now, we're not saying that everyone should go away and use these terms, but certainly within an organisation, we want to be fairly clear what we're talking about when we're talking about what is evidence-based practice or evidence-informed. And so for evidence-based, we've put forward that where there's a clear intervention, that's been tested against a well-constructed control group with something rigorous like a randomised controlled trial, or at very least a good quasi-experimental trial, and shown a differential outcome in favour of that intervention. We're going to call that evidence-based. On the other hand, actually, a lot of things that teachers want to do in the classroom won't be some well-defined intervention package. It might arise from cognitive science, or perhaps looking at some of the recommendations on the Education Endowment Foundation website and tools. And so we're calling evidence-informed practice, where a teacher is looking at the research evidence, incorporating that with their professional judgment to try and apply something as a strategy or an intervention at a smaller scale in terms of their classroom instruction. I think a really important point about science, and I'm a huge fan. I trained as a science teacher. Obviously, I did a year of physics. That qualified me as a physics specialist for a while. But what it can't do is tell you what you should value. It can tell you what is, not what ought to be. And I think a really important caveat about the role of evidence is that it shouldn't circumvent the social and political discussions about what is education for, what is its purpose, what are we trying to achieve. These are moral and political and social things that shouldn't be circumvented by these sort of discussions about evidence. And certainly one of the resistances, I think, to evidence-based practice is where people who want to argue about the purposes of education feel that sometimes discussions about the science of education feel that it's kind of getting in the way of those discussions. In fact, evidence acts not like a map or a travel guide or whatever, but more like a compass. Once you have an idea about where you want to go, it can help you incrementally move towards those aims. Right. Fantastic, we have a musical accompaniment. Now this is relevant for us because Teach First as an organisation is committed to, well, you can see on the side here, how much you achieve in life should not be determined by how much your parents earn. We're signed up to the FEA, the Fair Education Alliance, impact goals, which includes things like ensuring that young people from low-income backgrounds achieve well at Key Stage 2 and Key Stage 4, that young people are well supported to pursue the aspirations that they have, and improving things like access to universities or the kind of the best quality apprenticeships and all the kind of rich opportunities that should exist regardless of how wealthy your parents are. And so the evidence relating to these things is clearly relevant to our work as a charity and relevant to the teachers who work with Teach First and with the young people. So, in terms of the kinds of questions we asked some of our respondents in this bit of research, one of them was around this idea of what is the intelligent consumer of research. Our respondents kind of identified, and we kind of organised them into kind of 4 broad themes. So one of the themes, this idea of professional skepticism. There's a lovely quote by Richard Feynman, who describes skepticism as an exquisite balance between open-mindedness to new ideas, but then a rigorous scrutiny of those ideas to really test their quality. In order to be a critical thinker, one has to understand something about the domain in which you are trying to critically think. And so understanding about some of the science of learning, some of the questions and arguments around curriculum, both at a subject level or at a phase level, are the domain within which teachers can exercise this critical thinking. But it also requires some tools. Research methods, particularly those used in education and social science, they're not non-specialist subjects. It can take many years to really develop an understanding of the sort of data analysis and research methods that are used. And obviously, one of the points of this is where can we naturally try to fit these in with the kinds of things that new teachers are trying to develop in terms of their classroom practice generally. And lastly, all of this has limited, if any, benefit if it's not actually changing what teachers are doing in the classroom. So what can we say about how we might try and apply some of these ideas in practice? Okay, so professional skepticism. This is something quite close to my heart. Before becoming a teacher, I was a sceptical parapsychologist, and perhaps some of that's kind of stuck with me over the years. But this willingness to interrogate claims about how children learn and how we can help them learn was an important theme that came through in many of our interviews. The ability to ask challenging questions about practice, to be able to think critically and interrogate the face value of claims, to be able to identify some of the red flags that exist about research. If you find the sample size was 3 people, to what extent can we generalise that kind of evidence? But to also, not just to apply this to external claims, but also to themselves. We know that human beings are, as a great result of our evolution, have a range of biases, whether that's confirmation bias and ignoring evidence that goes against our ideas. There's a lovely thing called the IKEA effect. I don't know if anyone's ever heard of that one. Any fans of IKEA in the audience? Do you want to put your hands up? Yeah? Okay, well, one of the things they have found is that when individuals spend time building their own furniture, they tend to rate the quality of that furniture as higher than the ones that have been made for them. When we put time, effort, investment and energy into things, we tend to rate those things as being better. And these biases we bring when we're trying to evaluate our own practice are another way that we need to be able to challenge through this kind of professional skepticism. Now, within sort of looking at research and looking at research methods, often you'll see how to read a research paper, or sort of what sort of questions should you ask yourself when looking at a piece of research. One of the arguments might be that whilst these are a useful aid memoir and a good bit of structure, they do require expert knowledge, understanding what is appropriate for a sample size, or whether the analysis actually answers the question that the researcher put. What valid inferences can you draw from the data analysis that's been done? Are not questions that you can just do without some background and specialist knowledge. So what might form really the knowledge base within which that critical thinking can occur? And our respondents suggested actually really understanding some of the common misconceptions within education can act as a nice starting point, a negative example against some of these ideas that perhaps are not very well evidenced. An introduction to some of the more reliable principles about how children learn, a basic grasp of empirical methods. Obviously, education research has all sorts of methodologies associated with it, but actually understanding a bit about empirical methods and statistics may advantage teachers to make sense of the research that they're reading. So another aspect of this domain is looking at kind of learning and curriculum. So again, as novice teachers coming into a new profession, there's an enormous amount to learn about curriculum knowledge, the sequencing of learning, the use of assessment, which all forms background knowledge within which you can start to try and interpret research. I talked a little bit already about misconceptions about learning, but the idea that the pyramid of learning, you only remember 10% of what you read, but 75% of what you do or something, which are not based on any evidence, they've just been made up. Actually recognising that there are ideas about how children learn that are not well evidenced, that are not good bets. And one of the possibilities really is to help perhaps new teachers coming into the profession to inoculate them, to use an analogy, against perhaps some of the unevidenced ideas that do float around within our education system. And replace that to give us another way of looking at the same problems, an introduction to some of the work coming out of both cognitive science, organisations like the Deans for Impact, the IES over in the States, identifying the small number of fairly reliable principles that we can talk about in terms of how children learn as a starting point for developing their knowledge and professional application of that. However, learning to be a teacher is really hard. A lot of our respondents said, coming in with bucket loads of theory about cognitive science, right early on is probably not the way to help teachers really to scaffold their understanding of this. And actually, initially, it really needs to have a sort of practical application focus, with theory being introduced over time to help people get under the hood, perhaps of some of the principles that exist. So, what can we say about research methods and data analysis? One of our respondents, who'd been a researcher for, decades, a professor in their own right, said that after decades of being a researcher, I think I'm just starting to get good at it. I think our expectations for here do need to be modest. And we need to kind of try and find natural links with the busy curriculum that already exists for trainee teachers in terms of where do the opportunities lie to help them start building this background knowledge to be able to assess research in the future. So in terms of research methods, perhaps one of the natural points where you might be able to discuss these things is where you're talking to teachers about how they're evaluating the progress of students in their classroom, the strategies that they're using, and assessing progress. And to support that, you might bring in perhaps some of the strengths and limitations of the various methodologies that exist both in classroom research but also in more widespread research, whether that's quantitative methods or qualitative methods. But also, data analysis and statistics is one of these rabbit holes that goes very deep. You can spend huge amounts of your professional life trying to get your head around what kind of data analysis would best fit these things. But perhaps a natural starting point might be where there are links in with assessment practice and assessment theory as a way of introducing some basic statistical concepts that teachers might find useful. And our respondents suggested Daniel Koretz's book, Measuring Up, as a wonderful starting place if you want to talk about things like validity and reliability. Daisy Christodoulou's recent book, Making Good Progress, and the works of Dylan William, as sort of points at which you can start to intersect assessment practice and theory and some of these sort of the deeper notions of data analysis and statistics that they might need to learn. But also helping teachers make sense of evidence-based research. There are a whole ranges. I mean, so thinking of the EEF and the kind of work they do, obviously alongside questions about efficacy or effectiveness, there are also process kinds of evaluation. And again, getting teachers to think about the different kinds of evaluation questions they might have and how they might match up to different methodologies. But in terms of the sort of the key concepts, I mean, null hypothesis testing and p-values, effect sizes. I mean, obviously the EEF relates all these things as months progress, but new teachers should at least have some opportunity to dig behind that to understand, well, what does that actually mean? Correlations and the fact that they don't necessarily give you cause. Also, sources of measurement error. The number of graphs you sometimes see where there seems to be, arguably no difference between the two bars, but, it's presented as this is a difference, this is a change, without really perhaps any great understanding of measurement error or how you might represent that. But of course, all of this is great, but unless it's actually changing what teachers do in the classroom, it's not going to do any good. So the last bit really is, how do we help take all of this stuff and turn it into something we do in the classroom? So one of the aspects of this is really helping new teachers thinking about how do we implement a strategy or an intervention within the context of the classroom, and how do we evaluate whether this is having any kind of difference for my students. It's very unlikely to come about through mere exposure. Even if new teachers have got a very good grasp of research methods and some basic statistical concepts, they're going to need some scaffolding to be able to bring this into practice. But also evaluating impact is nigh on impossible. I think Ben Goldacre once on Twitter said, teachers, if your idea of significant evidence is 30 students in a classroom with no comparison group, your sector is broken. But for a classroom teacher, that's the reality. And so actually being able to draw valid inferences from the kinds of data you might collect about what's happening in terms of your students' learning is extremely hard. But also thinking about inquiry. And again, many inquiry models exist for teacher practice. Many of them focus, I think, rather exclusively on reflection. We might argue that reflection is necessary but not sufficient, really, to change practice in the classroom. And without an element of challenge to that actually causes the teacher to change what they're doing, it's unlikely to have any benefits for the students, or less likely to. And so just moving towards an implementation cycle might be a better way of structuring the way that teachers think about the kinds of inquiry projects they might undertake as student teachers. And really in deference to the fact that, assessing outcomes is extremely hard. Perhaps at a cohort level you might be able to do something, but at the individual level of a classroom. But I mean, certainly you can try to evaluate to see whether or not the thing that you've implemented is actually having the benefits you anticipated. So if you put in a strategy helping children with physics misconceptions, for instance, and you discover those misconceptions are still hale and hearty 5 weeks after you've tried out your new teaching strategy, you can be fairly sure that you probably need to do a plan B. But also, rather than necessarily expecting new teachers to kind of cast their net over Google Scholar to find things that they can implement in this classroom is to, again, sort of highlight some of the good bets arising from evidence-based practice that might act as a starting point for something they might try to implement and see, well, this works when you look at the EF toolkit, or perhaps you look at Paschler et al. But does it work in my classroom? Is it actually having the benefits for my students that we might expect to see? Okay, so we talked through perhaps some of the sort of the areas that our respondents suggested would be important for helping new teachers to build up the knowledge required to have that critical stance around educational, psychological research and evidence-based practice. So in terms of where might this intersect with the Teach First programme as it currently stands and moving forward? Well, one of the real issues is actually finding good quality research evidence is really hard. Recently wrote a TES article basically saying that, you know, for most teachers it's a bit of a waste of time. You can spend forever trying to find something classroom-facing on Google Scholar related to the things that are keeping you awake at night, and often it's a fruitless endeavour. So, as an organisation, one of the things we can do is try to curate a little, point new teachers towards the kind of research that might actually be useful for them to be thinking about in terms of the kind of changes of practice they might want to undertake. So, highlighting and signposting reliable sources of evidence for them as a starting point for thinking about this process. And again, over a 2-year period, we can start to try to sort of narrow channel, quite curated, but then opening up over time. So it might start with evidence summaries, like what makes great teaching, but eventually, of course, we want teachers to be able to kind of start looking at perhaps some of the primary references underpinning some of those things. Or we might start with, I don't know, something like retrieval practice as a fairly reliable principle that you might try out in your classroom, but then introduce students to the theories that actually underlie why this might work and why it might not work in some circumstances. And one of the ways that we can scaffold this is by producing worked examples of what these things look like in practice. Because I think one of the hardest things, but just talking as when I was a leading practitioner working in schools, is, you know, you talk to a teacher about a bit of research about perhaps how children learn, or perhaps some of the evidence arising from interventions that appear to be successful. And the hardest step is, well, what do I do tomorrow? What does this look like in my classroom? What am I going to do differently? And I think one of the ways that we can really help new teachers get to grips with that is by giving them worked examples and models of where people have actually tried to do this. Not so that they just ape them or copy them, but they can use that as a model for thinking about the kinds of interventions that they're trying to make. Trying to use, rather than necessarily a reflexive cycle, also examples of how might an implementation cycle look like across a sequence of trying out a new idea in the classroom. And actually, evaluation methods, and I'll talk about this in a minute, is really hard. And so again, kind of opportunities to look at models and examples of how other student teachers have tackled this could be really useful. But perhaps one of the key things is that, you know, front-loading this stuff or giving it as a big kind of section over, I don't know, an inset day or something, is extremely unlikely to help these people, help new teachers make changes to their practice. So we need to be able to distribute it. One of our respondents had the lovely phrase, running like the letters through a stick of rock, with opportunities to return to some of these ideas just in time as you're kind of expanding their horizons in terms of the research that they're looking at. Now, Teach First sort of works with our partners to train teachers working in very challenging schools, but alongside this, we're also very interested in developing their leadership. And part of this research was also a rather critical view at what's going on within leadership research, because that also, I would argue, should come from a strong evidence base. Leadership research has expanded a huge amount over the last 25 years, but very little of it is empirically what I would call quite strong. A lot of it is based on, you know, sort of more theoretical driven constructs, which often lack good empirical support. And most leadership development has not been evaluated in a particularly tough way. Arthur, 2003, talking from a meta-analysis of the impact of leadership development, arguing that it very rarely leads to documented long-term changes in behaviour. There are also, there are a number of ideas that sort of in psychology, for instance, would be considered rather fringe. They've been sort of kicked out a bit. So things like the Myers-Briggs Type Inventory, a very popular tool for reflection in leadership, is beset with problems. Its reliability is extremely poor. And there's an argument that at the end of the day, if you're trying to challenge yourself as a leader, providing feedback that's not based on valid categories or labels is very unlikely to validly challenge yourself as a leader. What may happen instead is that individuals will just simply see themselves in whatever analysis comes out of it, or they'll interpret their behaviours as already doing the thing that looks like it's being effective. But also, I mean, even very popular ideas like emotional intelligence. Daniel Goleman's work, very highly respected, very popular within leadership, within psychology, is quite a controversial subject. Some psychologists accuse Goleman's construction of emotional intelligence as being essentially pop psychology. It may be that organisations aren't really aware that some of these ideas are quite contested. If we want to be able to develop leadership, perhaps one of the angles we might put in would be to look at the way leaders engage with research evidence. At the end of the day, a school leader's decisions about what kind of interventions or structures or things we're going to be doing in the school are very influential. So one might argue they need a much deeper understanding and engagement with research evidence than a classroom teacher. They also apply them across a wider canvas, whether it's a head of department or across a school. They also need to be able to implement new strategies and changes within the school environment and be able to evaluate them. And so one of the arguments might be is that actually developing as a leader and developing as a classroom practitioner in terms of taking research evidence and putting it into practice and being able to evaluate it, the work of a leader and the work of a classroom practitioner is essentially leadership in microcosm in terms of some of the elements of the knowledge and skills that effective leaders might need. But we also know that leaders need to be able to shape a culture in which debate and use of evidence is supported and permitted. And so again, by helping new leaders or prospective leaders in the future engaging with research evidence could be an important part of their development. Lastly, obviously, we're really keen to evaluate it. As Arthur said, it's all very well doing leadership and teacher development, but, how do we know? And so one of the interesting questions was talking to our respondents about, well, what other ideas might we put in place to try and evaluate both our teaching, contributions to teaching and leadership. Obviously, if you wanted to answer questions about efficacy or effectiveness, you're going to have to work with an external evaluator. And certainly we might expect people doing leadership development to have established links with external evaluators to look at that kind of efficacy. But realistically, I mean, a lot of these projects looking at the effectiveness of a particular programme might take 3, 4, 5 years to come to fruition for you to actually get the data. And obviously, you don't really want to kind of sit there, run something for 3 or 5 years and then discover, oh, it didn't work. You need to be able to kind of sort of look at it in fine grain as you're flying the aeroplane, you're having to build it as well. So there are different levels, and someone like Guskey sort of provides a simple framework for thinking about, well, what ways might we sort of look at evaluating aspects of our programme. One of the things that's sort of popular in other professions, so if you look at medicine or law, is professional exams and qualifications. Now, I'm not suggesting we have an exam, but I mean, certainly we can assess things like assessment theory. I mean, some of the key concepts there. If you want to know whether they've been learnt, well, we're teachers, aren't we? We've got a pretty good way of doing that. However, we also, just knowing it isn't enough. We also want to see whether it's actually making a change in terms of what the teacher's doing in the classroom. And so we want to see whether there are changes of behaviour that have come about as the result of the things that people have learnt. And so trying to triangulate perhaps what they've learnt with perhaps our support roles, school mentors and others, what can they observe about that teacher's practice that might help triangulate with some of the things that we can ask them. And in terms of plausible evidence of outcome, well, you know, it's almost impossible for a classroom teacher to isolate their impacts, and certainly in terms of this narrow strand. I mean, in amongst the crowded curriculum of ITE, how will we know whether we've got research-engaged new teachers coming into the profession? It's going to be very hard to isolate that particular effect. But at the very least, we can kind of see whether it's not happening, or whether people are kind of rejecting evidence-based practice. So we can't give a positive answer, but we can at least see if it's going in, you know, in the right direction. And if it's going in the wrong direction, do something about it. But also, I think one of the really interesting things is that actually models of what it looks like for a teacher to take a bit of research evidence and put it into practice and then try and evaluate it is gold dust. Lots of people have said, well, yeah, what would be great? We've seen worked examples of all these kind of things. And we agree. And actually, one of the ways that we could also evaluate it would be to have a platform whereby new teachers are sharing these ideas, sharing these models, so that we can actually share that with the wider sector, the promises as well as the pitfalls. So, what might be a sketch of a kind of a model of practitioner inquiry that would bring some of these elements together? And this, as I said, I mean, all of this is thinking out loud. And the purpose of this is not to say this is how all teacher inquiry should take place. It's more of a discussion about, well, what kind of elements might be in there and what kind of resources might support it. Asking good evaluation questions is really hard. One of the, well, I mean, certainly from my background, I mean, when I worked briefly at university, I would work with third-year undergraduates in psychology doing their final year projects. And inevitably, when they came in, one of the hardest jobs was actually turning their rather vague ideas about what they'd like to do into an operationalised hypothesis that would actually, you could test in some way. And it's extremely difficult as a classroom practitioner. You know, is my homework working? Isn't a structured enough question to really be able to kind of evaluate what's happening in terms of the outcomes. So this is just an example. So this from Gary Jones' blog. I don't know if he's in the audience. But, you know, getting new teachers to think about their kind of the background questions, which might be quite broad. You know, how am I doing this? What should I do? And then foreground questions and the PICO format. Pupils, who are the relevant pupils that you're going to be investigating, whether there's a change or an advantage. The intervention, can you actually define what it is you're planning to do? Sometimes that's quite hard. What's going to be your comparison group? Now, obviously, as a classroom teacher, you're very unlikely to be able to do an RCT. But at the very least, you can think very hard about what your baseline would be, and what your outcomes would be, and how you might assess those. And that kind of links in with the outcomes. What are the anticipated effects that you're expecting to see that at least you can put your ideas to the testing for? Now, again, I mean, you know, scaffolding this, I think, is going to be really important. Having good operationalised questions about the kinds of things that keep teachers awake at night is quite a challenging prospect. It requires quite a lot of knowledge about being a teacher to be able to kind of refine that. So again, I think models of examples of where somebody has taken a background question and been able to operationalise it a little in terms of their classroom practice could be very helpful. So, asking good questions is hard, and actually then finding research evidence that goes along with those questions is even harder. We want, really, teachers to have access to the kind of research that's relevant to the many short and long-term challenges that teachers have to address, the knotty problem that keeps them awake at night. And most research doesn't talk about that. So we have a responsibility, I think, with our university partners in terms of the kinds of research evidence that we're helping new teachers to access. Expecting them to find it on their own, or just kind of from the references cited on a piece of work, isn't realistic, I would argue. So some initial curation of this could be really helpful. And as I've said, I think pointing people towards really high-quality summaries is probably a very good starting point. Pointing people towards examples where it's actually got quite good links to the kinds of different things you could try out in the classroom. So something like the IES Practice Guide, Organising Study and Instruction. It's got some nice examples there, could act as a starting point. But also, actually a further bit of scaffolding would be to then link up these to the kinds of questions that new teachers tend to ask. And they tend to ask questions, you know, a lot about things like behaviour and planning and sequence of learning and assessment. So that they can use these to adapt them to their own question and to their own context. So, asking good questions, finding good evidence are really hard. Even harder is then appraising the quality of that evidence. And as I've said, it's not a generic skill. It requires a great deal of background knowledge, experience and expertise to really appraise a piece of research evidence for its quality. So, again, to actually get really good at doing this will take decades. And some of our participants will go on to do PhDs and go further and eventually start to develop that to the high degree where perhaps they can confidently assess. However, for the most, they won't. And so we need to kind of have quite modest expectations of the extent to which new teachers can appraise research evidence. And this means, again, we need to point them towards sources of evidence where some of that appraisal has already taken place. And in terms of the criticality, is get them to look at the way that that evidence has been appraised. So we could point them to the EF toolkit, but then also look at the way that the EF toolkit appraises that evidence. How do they rate the strength of that evidence and what kind of factors are important in those decisions? And again, this might help scaffold an approach they can use in the future. So all the bits I've mentioned so far are hard. The hardest step is actually making a difference to something you do in the classroom. How are you going to apply this? And as I said, you know, it doesn't matter what quality of evidence you point people towards, how useful it might be. Actually putting it into practice is neither straightforward nor guaranteed. The classic example is about feedback. Dylan William sort of talking about the meta-analysis of feedback, you know, plus 8 months. But something like a third of those studies have no effect or negative effect on outcomes. So none of these are straight bets. They all require implementation. So rather than thinking about following a recipe, we need to help teachers really think about how they're implementing these kinds of strategies arising from good quality evidence into their classroom and how they're evaluating it. And again, models of that, as I said before, could be extremely useful for new teachers to be able to do this, and again, might be of value to the wider sector. Lastly, how do we assess it? Well, if all the steps up to now have been hard, I'm going to say this one is nigh on impossible. Certainly at the level of an effectiveness trial. You know, new teachers doing RCTs is extremely unlikely. So we need them to really be able to think about the kinds of range of biases that might influence their assessment, their personal assessment of whether something is successful, so they become more sceptical about their own opinion, but also be able to have a look at the kinds of use of assessment and the use of structures to at least be able to say whether the thing that they've implemented is having the kinds of benefits or not that it has in future. And I think, again, trying to think about how you improve your practice, how you might improve the implementation of a good bet, is probably better than expecting them to be able to really reliably assess at an outcomes level some of these things. Of course, actually I've mentioned there as well, I mean, we know in clinical practice there are concerns about analysis manipulation and even fraud. And again, you know, I think we have to be quite cautious about the pressure we put teachers under. I'm not just talking about new teachers now, in terms of demonstrating their own impact. Because, of course, if you stack all of the thing on, is what you're doing working, there will always be that temptation to potentially interpret your data creatively to ensure that it looks like you are. Okay, so where can you find out more? We're hoping the report will be up on the Teach First website at the end of the month. As I said, we're just collecting comments back, both from internal stakeholders and some of our respondents. But But this is very much thinking out loud. This is a discussion document. None of these, knowledge mobilisation and putting evidence into practice are not easy, as I hope I've got across. And so your comments, suggestions, if you decide to take away bits of it and try it out and it doesn't work, or bits that do work, feel free to get in touch and let me know. My email address there, or you can pester me on Twitter. Thank you very much. Okay, we're out of time, although I'm around for the rest of the day. If you have any kind of urgent questions you want to ask me today, please feel free.